Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. I'm always happy to be here.
You're welcome. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form. But this is about global politics, so we'll be talking about that. Several big topics today. So first, let's take about the strange death of Ebrahim Raisi, including the Iranian finance minister and others. So, what should we make out of it all? Means there was this sudden big news, went for a couple of days. Now there is a bit of a silence. The world is trying, at least from this part of the world, I'm trying to understand what this was all about. What is the incident, accident? What was it?
So, so the most interesting thing is that the preliminary findings by the Iranian military seem to point that it was an accident. And actually, many experts stated the same, that it's very often that small airplanes and helicopters crash in the mountains if it's foggy and the weather is bad. And those helicopters were very old and poorly maintained. Now, the strange thing is that all of the important officials, the president, the foreign minister, the governor of the province, and several others, were all in the same airplane, and that they did not have any professional escort helicopters with them. We also know that the Iranians clearly covered up the fact that they knew that everybody was dead from the very beginning, sometimes just to gain a few hours before the publicity struck, who knows why. We also know that Raisi had several conflicts within the regime, including with Khamenei's son, who is now considered one of the leading candidates, Mustafa Khamenei. But Mustafa at one point benefited from Raisi because he used them to get rid of other political families like Laranjani family, who were potential rivals for the position. And Raisi was not particularly well liked in the foreign policy establishment or any echelons of power. He was poorly educated. He had a sixth grade education. During at the time of the incident, there were four possibilities. One, that it was an accident due to very poor planning, sloppiness, and just poor maintenance and corruption. Second, that it was some sort of a domestic opposition hit. Third, that it was foreign powers using domestic opposition to send a deterrence message to the regime, which was not all that likely because Raisi was not a decision maker, and his death doesn't change anything. And also, the regime can always just blame it on Israel, the United States, the usual suspects, and take credit whether or not anyone actually did it. And of course, the fourth possibility, that a regime faction took him out. Now, whether it was really an accident or they don't want to admit that they were the ones who killed it, they clearly cannot blame it for whatever reason on foreign powers. So they had to actually admit that it was an accident, even though would have been easier for them not to play propaganda games. So I think that in itself is very interesting. In reality, his death doesn't change anything. There's still going to be a struggle for power. It just comes earlier than the end of his term limit, and it just makes it easier for the regime to assert an even more authoritarian control over politics. But he was not particularly cared for. It was not like Soleimani, which was a huge blow to the regime. They did the usual propaganda funerals, but there were also a lot of celebrations on the streets from the victims. Actually, the biggest mourner of Raisi seemed to be the United Nations, strangely enough. So that tells you something when the people of the country are doing fireworks and the UN is standing in mourning. I don't even know what to say.
Right, right. So let's look at it this way. Who benefits from this? Who loses here?
Well, I mean, Raisi is obviously dead, so that's his biggest loss. But the beneficiary is obviously Mustafa uh, Khamenei, for who clears the spot towards his own political ascent, and of course anybody else in the faction who was tired of Raisi and wanted to get rid of him because he was putting a bad image of Iran. Actually, for everyone else, it does not really change much.
Right. But in terms of the politics now, after the elections, when I guess it is going to be held very soon, what will be its impact? Whoever gets elected, what will be its impact on politics? The way they will look at Israel, Middle East, and the way they will look at relations between Israel, Iran, as well as US, and other factors here. How do you see that working, not working?
Well, the reason it's not going to change at all from the current situation is because the president in Iran is not a decision maker. It's a completely symbolic puppet figure controlled entirely by the Ayatollahs. The much greater succession crisis is around the position of the supreme guy, the supreme leader, who is, in his mid 80s. He's had numerous health scares, and there's naturally a discussion of who will follow in his footsteps. It has to be most likely a religious figure or somebody with religious education. It cannot be anyone like Raisi, who was poorly educated, not at all with the religious establishment, didn't have a religious rank. So he would not have been playing a part in that at all anyway.
Right,
But we
right.
can't imagine that anything will get any better from the current situation in terms of downplaying tensions, because the ideological line is still the same.
Right, right. And talking of Iran, let's talk about about India's port deal with Iran. How do you see that panning? Any impact on that? And what about this some sort of reports about sanctions here?
So India is looking for a way out now that the India Middle East Europe corridor has been disrupted by various wars in the region, and so the Iranian port is one way to recoup the potential losses in trade. And but the truth is that port has been unofficially used for trade between Iran and India already for a very long time. So actually the formalizing of this deal does not really uh, change much from a strategic or security perspective. It merely boosts the volume of trade going through that area and positions India more strategically towards its interests in the Middle East. It is of concern to the US. The US has some US officials have threatened sanctions because officially they're supposed to sanction any official trade deals with Iran, but it's very unlikely to happen. They certainly did not end up imposing any sanctions on Pakistan when it concluded a $10 billion trade deal with Iran just recently. So I don't expect that to happen in this case either. And in fact, the reaction has been largely muted despite these concerns.
Right, right. Now let's move to the other part of the Middle East. This is the Israel-Hamas crisis, and in that, the political development is Spain, Norway, Ireland. They have recognized Palestine. What does it mean? Means a lot of people have not. A lot have now started beginning, doing that, and especially these two, the three very known countries, very impactful. So, how should we understand this? The significance of this particular move.
So interestingly, a lot of it is more about the internal domestic politics in those countries than anything really impacting Israel or the Palestinians. All three have communist or socialist or very hard left governments. They're facing migration problems internally, all sorts of internal issues. Spain is facing its own issues with separatism. Uh, you know, Ireland's got its trouble with the British always, and Norway, while a fairly stable and very wealthy country, just has had very radical left ideology, and now it's also got an issue with Russia in Europe and those security concerns. So you would think that now would be a good time to focus on their own security concerns, but this is a good way to rile up voting base and give red meat over something that is not essential and is also not likely to happen. Symbolic recognitions of these states just adds to the list of 139 countries that theoretically recognize Palestine but practically have not enforced these decisions for various reasons, including security concerns and lack of a unified government among Palestinians. But what's interesting is who is pushing these countries towards this end. On the one hand, they're clearly taking cues from the Biden administration, and they only started making these moves after Biden changed his rhetoric. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia has been apparently lobbying these countries to take these steps and has now formed a coalition with Norway to start this exploratory process of state building. Not sure how that's going to work out because you really need the Palestinians on board, at least for part of this process, but a lot of it seems to be more about generating anti Israel animus than about creating any practical framework for problem solving. So I see this process as more propaganda and political posturing than any real uh, process towards Palestinians, especially since the war is still ongoing and there is no real um, framework or infrastructure for state building at this moment.
Right, right, Irina. But such moves, they do create a lot of noise, a lot of dust, and a lot of understanding. Perhaps that perhaps the two-state solution is a could be the long-lasting solution, and people start thinking towards that. Do you think the world is preparing towards that? Also, do you think Israel is more and more getting isolated with ICJ demanding conditional stop to Israel's operation in Rafah, and Rafah operations already on? Then it is already ICC recommends arrest warrant for Israeli officials and Hamas officials both. All these things. So do you think Israel is getting uh, sidelined, or the world is looking at it, or is it Benjamin Netanyahu, and maybe the world is preparing for a time where Benjamin Netanyahu is not in the thick of affairs and somebody else comes in, and then a two-state solution could be looked at? How do you see all these developments in terms of Israel, in terms of the future of the Middle East crisis?
Well, ironically, the ICC decision to to call for an arrest warrant for Netanyahu is the very factor that, first of all, is most likely to unify the Israeli public behind him, despite all of the domestic criticism of his various failings. And second, it's also most likely to entrench Netanyahu himself and give him more reasons not to leave office, because at least now he's protected within Israel by his immunity if he's to leave office, then potentially his opponents or domestic political enemies could even turn him over, or at least make it signal rhetorically that they're more open to this arrest. Although, to be clear, for now, the Israeli public, including the opposition parties, have all condemned this decision as based in nothing but prejudice. And ICJ decision, by the way, did not fully tell Israel to stop operations in Rafah or Gaza. They just told them to abstain from any activity violating the international law. The Biden administration actually said that they're satisfied with the evidence Israel presented about taking measures to follow the international law. They have moved 1 million refugees in just a matter of weeks into a refugee camp out of harm's way, which is unprecedented. Um, and the pier that the U.S. wanted to be built was built. Unfortunately, it was very quickly ruined by poor construction choices and is now going to be offline for a week while it's being repaired. But that is not Israel's fault.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you see, Israel has not stopped and it has gone into Rafah. And the thing is that they have discovered 700 tunnels there, 50 leading to Egypt. What does it mean? Means, will the world see that Egypt is playing a strong role in aiding Hamas? What about the relationship between between Israel and Egypt now?
Well, the only reason to air such information if you think that it will give you some public sympathy from the international community. It will not. It will absolutely not change anything. Nobody outside Israeli and Jewish sources is commenting about this. Nobody cares how many tunnels lead to Egypt. Nobody even knows how these tunnels are really administered. It's just not the main point of discussion anywhere outside these circles. So the discussion is mostly internal. In my opinion, it's mostly to take away, to distract from other problems. The fact that Israel is being isolated on the international stage. The European Union just called for additional sanctions against Israel over the incident this morning involving yesterday involving a refugee camp deaths, which Israel attributes to a Hamas related incident. Unfortunately, Israel is losing politically, and in fact, a public campaign against Egypt is probably not going to win it any friends in Egypt or fix any problems. To be sure, it's troubling that there are 50 tunnels on the side that Egypt controls. That said, nobody knows how long they've been there, whether or not they were simply overlooked. There is local corruption, there's local incompetence in the military forces. It's very doubtful that it was approved from the very top. Attacking Sisi is not in Israel's interest because he's been the one fighting Hamas the most. There is clearly still a Muslim Brotherhood problem in Egypt, but attacking the authorities over it is not going to fix it. All it does is actually play into Hamas' plan, by the way, to destabilize the Camp David Accords and to make to isolate Israel even further and possibly strike up a war between Egyptians and Israelis. And we've seen the unfortunate incident involving the death of an Egyptian soldier and the wounding of several others. This is not a situation that Israel needs, and I think that public rhetoric over this issue is not going to be helpful.
Right, right, Irina. Now let's move from the uh, Middle East to the US, where this politics is also happening. That's in the form of protests. Manufacture protects is a big business. It seems nowadays. Help us understand what's happening. There is this investigations in the US reveal big Democratic donors, foreign connections, CCP role. What should one understand of this? That it was not natural, it was all manufactured, and students were a part of all this?
Well, the students are the least to blame for the situation, other than being completely ignorant of the issues. And, surely, however, that is not the first or the last time students protest over global concerns they know nothing about. Who's to blame is the faculty, some of whom led these protests, and the faculty would have the access to the full body of information that the students do not. The university administrators who allowed violence to break out and did nothing to prevent these um, situations from happening. And of course, Of course, the Democratic donors contributing literally millions of dollars to the coordinated organization of these protests, not including, by the way, genocidal rhetoric from the river to the sea. For those who don't know, this is not about the creation of a two-state. This is about genocide of Israelis and wiping them out from the entire area that is being referred to. Of course, the CCP has fed off of it. This is not the first or the last time. We remember the BLM protests, which followed, by the way, the exact same model, and Russia is surely likely to be involved. The original model for this sort of seemingly grassroots, but inorganic protest movement is Russian, dating back to the 1960s civil unrest. And of course, Qatar and all these Muslim Brotherhood organizations have contributed generously to the same cause. And it's unbelievable that the university administrators are not seeing that this is not about the students expressing their personal opinion. This is about assorted agendas and activists. There's been professionals caught training students, bringing in weapons. In some cases, we've seen ideological heirs to billionaires living in Brooklyn in their 40s coming in and intervening with the protests, actually leading the protests. So a lot of protesters are not even students; they're outsiders who are not even from the university at all. So now, a lot of these things came together. It's very clear that there are strong opinions and emotions, but some of these opinions and emotions are bought and paid for, and others are not based in any sort of real connections. And what's the worst part is that the universities, instead of taking disciplinary measures against those who are disrupting peace, are instead catering to their demands. They're giving in to various demands. Some of them are divesting from Israeli companies or defense companies that are invested in Israel, doing business in Israel. So all of that is sending a message that the sort of violent, loud, discriminatory um, push actually works, and that people can get what they want without engaging with others, without hearing their opinions, and by simply threatening and disrupting. That sort of policy, this appeasement policy, is the most dangerous element here.
Absolutely. Now let's move on from Middle East crisis and the U.S. protests to another crisis, that's the Russia-Ukraine one. There seems to be some sort of movement with Putin saying that you leave with me the seized territories and there will be a frozen conflict. What does this all mean? Means is this the end, or is Zelensky will not agree to this and this will continue to happen? Is Zelensky a part of the problem or is the solution to the problem?
Zelensky is a reflection of the popular will. Because Ukraine, unlike Russia, is a democracy, the leaders have to listen to the voice of the people. The very same people who did not allow the Russians to break through to Kiev in 3 days, and who fought valiantly since then, would also be would also kick Zelensky out of office if he gave in to Russian demands. It's as simple as that, and I'm not sure anyone in the West fully understands it. They think there are a lot of people believe that Americans or the British or NATO or some foreign entities are, funding the war and killing Ukrainians. But the fact is, Ukrainians would continue to die regardless of U.S. support. They would actually die in far greater numbers without having the weapons to fight with, because they're dedicated to preserving their sovereignty. So, you know, Putin is trying to put pressure on Zelensky to present him as somebody who's gambling with people's lives. But in reality, there is a huge stark difference between an authoritarian regime where one man decides everything and a free country that just does not want to be in any way controlled by somebody else, especially after that somebody else violently invaded it twice. And has and there's documented cases of atrocities and incitement, and all these things. That is not a way you can get someone to the negotiating table or to get concessions that you want by having built up that background, smeared everyone involved, including Zelensky. It's just not going to happen. This is a message for the West. It's not a message for the Ukrainians.
Right, right. Now let's move from two crises, existing crisis, to another possible crisis in the making that's looking like China's latest threats to Taiwan in reaction to their new president. What should we make out of this with all these exercises, simulations, and all these things? Do you think these are all mere, tactics, or there is something more to it? Is Taiwan ready for this, or is the world ready for this? Is the US and all their allies ready for this?
Well, China's window of opportunity to take Taiwan by violent means is closing as the US election is approaching. Uh, it's not, anything could happen. We don't know what the actual plan is, and any number of things can sway events in one direction and the other, because a lot of these wars are opportunistic. They all depend on where the US is, how many crises are happening simultaneously, who is in the White House, how committed they are, what are the signals going on from the government at any given moment. But for now, it's very clear that China is putting pressure increasingly more boldly, and it has managed to surprise Taiwan with the drills very close to its border as quote unquote punishment for electing the president. Now, all of this doesn't make any sense because drills in themselves, they're not violent. They're scary, but they're not violent. So why is it a punishment? What is China really trying to say here? And second, they know perfectly well that Taiwan is a democracy. They're disappointed that their effort to intervene in the Taiwanese elections did not work out. In fact, it backfired. People voted overwhelmingly in significant numbers for the party of the new president, precisely because as a backlash to this attempted attack on their sovereignty, and they just don't like this level of interference. But China also understands that there are other issues involved. In Taiwan, I think the real path is to continue manipulating public discontent over domestic policies that have nothing to do with China. But then at the same time, she is beginning to be impatient. He is becoming desperate. He is concerned that he may not have much time left to do what he needs to do. So he's setting to create a critical situation and to cause parties to make a mistake. And one mistake that was made is that how were the preparation for these drills missed by the Taiwanese military. So this exercise was less punishment and more information gathering expedition, in my opinion. China was testing Taiwan's reaction. Taiwan failed. And I think, and so did everyone else, by the way. It wasn't just Taiwan who failed, but the intelligence agencies, US, all the military, they failed to take note of these upcoming drills and to provide advance warning. That is much more worrying than the rhetoric from Beijing, because what they're learning from this is that despite several major, very public policy intelligence failures by the US and others in recent several years, they still have not improved their capability in response in critical situations, which was one of them. If China had wanted to launch a surprise attack this night, it could have done so. And this is, I don't think this is being evaluated with quite the seriousness and quite the attention that this issue deserves. I think it's far more alarming than what is the way it's being written up in the papers.
Right, right. So from China and Taiwan, from their their arch enemy, if you can say, that's the way they look at it. If it is from China's to China's friend Pakistan. So Pakistan has a $15 billion energy debt to China. How will they solve this? How does this look to be? And amidst all these things, a Pakistani poet has been abducted after facing intelligence threats. What's happening in that part of the world?
Well, I think Pakistan has very, very difficult path to repaying those debts. I think it will find itself actually taking on more debt to try to get out of this debt, while also facing an economic crisis due to years of mismanagement and increasing political instability and security situations on top of all of this. So I think this energy situation leaves them in a very precarious situation. Their dependency on China leaves them with very few options. They can try to look for other revenue streams elsewhere with Iran, as they're trying to do with Central Asian countries and with Middle Eastern countries like Qatar and UAE, who are potentially looking to invest into projects in the area, railways, and so forth. But all of these projects are nebulous. They're risky due to the security situation and due to Pakistan's record of not being able to repay its debt to China. That is not a good sign to any other investors, and also nobody wants to figure out who's the repayment situation, with China being so much in the lead. With such an advantage over Pakistan, do other countries even want to come in to compete? So we will see, I think, Pakistan becoming increasingly less independent in its policies and even more entrenched in Chinese projects. But at the same time, China wants its debts back. It's also facing a tough economic situation. It's been calling out countries like Sri Lanka on the full repayment of their debts recently, which put extreme pressure on Sri Lanka recovering from an economic crisis of its own. Um, we will see what happens, but I don't think a full bailout from somebody else is coming. Pakistan, just in its current situation, is just not that valuable. We are seeing some countries being willing to play there, to train military, to invest in some projects, but are they going to be? How much do they want to invest into a country that's already hugely indebted in someone else and facing security problems and a political strife with unclear outcomes? I don't think this is of particular value to anyone out there.
Right, right. So from politics to, let's move on to a bit of business. But here also the larger world politics is involved. Google is to make a major investment in Flipkart. That's what the news report says. India's e-commerce firm, and will shift its Pixel phone production to India. So India's relations with US corporations, it's picking up steam, and this also shows a lot of the dependency on China, that is disentanglement from China happening. So how do you look at this part? Is it how do you look at this all future in terms of business? More and more businesses coming to India.
I think we're seeing this. This is not just on the level of business deals, but a more strategic realignment, because we have seen recently that huge tech companies like Google and Microsoft and a few others have been investing heavily in UAE, for instance, and other projects, and it was openly backed by the United States government in an effort to kind of reorient those Middle East away from Chinese influence, and also towards other joint projects and exporting US soft power through business abroad. I think very much with India, it's kind of also there are two goals here. On the one hand, yes, there's lucrative opportunities in India that these companies are trying to capitalize on and be the early founders, investors, but clearly the shifting of phones into India from China, from other parts of Asia. This is also about strengthening the alliance with India, building up a front, and I do believe we'll find out sooner or later that there was an informal political negotiation at the back end of it, to create a kind of a broader infrastructure for these deals to happen faster and more smoothly, and to fit into the more general paradigm that the US is pursuing overall. That's not to say that the companies are not benefiting from it regardless, but I think the way it's being done and all these major investments simultaneously, they're not coincidental. They're not there is a pressure, there is an incentive to motivation to be moving rapidly towards these reinvestments. That's my sense of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a lot of things that we have covered in this week of the last 2 weeks happenings, and I'm sure a lot has made a lot of sense to a lot of people in terms of this. But I'm sure this world is changing, and it's changing very fast. Next week we will be having the Indian election results, and that we will cover in the coming weeks, and with many other things that we will keep on watching. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure as always.